Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I owe Professor Zeki, I think, special thanks for involving me in this very interesting event. The science of beauty has recently received new stimulus as the biological and psychological sciences have turned their attention to the arts. What is the psychological root of our attraction to beauty? Does evolutionary biology have anything to tell us about the emergence of art and the aesthetic? Can the great scientific advances made in the last 50 years throw new light on old issues in art theory and philosophical aesthetics? These are all interesting questions, and they are commanding increasing levels of attention at the intersection of the sciences and the humanities. It is not always appreciated, however, that this kind of inquiry has historical precedent. We have been here before, in the 18th century, a period when hopes were also high that innovative scientific methods might profitably be applied to questions of art and beauty. Aesthetics, in fact, is an 18th century invention, though the subject itself was up and running 10 years or so before that term was invented. Scotland can be said to have taken the lead, because the first sustained and significant work in philosophical aesthetics as we now know it was Francis Hutchisons' Inquiry into the original of our idea of beauty and virtue. This appeared in 1725. Hutchison, an Ulster Scot who had studied in Glasgow, was appointed professor of moral philosophy there a few years after his inquiry was published in London, and it had attracted considerable interest. Within Scotland, it inaugurated an extended debate about taste and beauty that continued for most of the century, and to which the major philosophical figures of the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, Thomas Reid, and Adam Smith, all contributed. And I might just point out that Adam Smith and Thomas Reid were amongst the founding fellows of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. David Hume had died 7 years or so before it was created. Alongside these famous names were names which, very prominent in their own time, are less well known today: Alexander Gerard, George Turnbull, George Campbell, and Henry Hume, Lord Kames. To appreciate both the nature and the novelty of this debate, it's essential to understand that the newfound subject of aesthetics did not constitute a freestanding inquiry pursued in isolation. On the contrary, it was just one aspect of an overarching project of the times, variously known as the science of human nature or the science of mind. David Hume is perhaps the most famous promoter of this project, and in the introduction to his treatise of human nature, he writes that, quote, "the four sciences of logic, morals, criticism, and politics include, quote, almost everything which can tend either to the improvement or the ornament of the human mind, and that the only solid foundation for these sciences must be laid in experiment and in experience and observation." Criticism, in this phrase, as Hume used it, means aesthetics. And to include it amongst the sciences of mind and describe its aim as improvement indicates that the science of beauty was not merely theoretical, but in a very broad sense practical. Science so conceived sought a better understanding of the faculties of the human mind, not simply for its own sake, but in order that they might be better used. Hume's philosophical writings, it should be observed, proved in many ways to be at intellectual odds with his Scottish contemporaries. In this passage, however, he's articulating a conception of philosophy that all of them shared, and the incorporation of criticism within the science of human nature was a standing assumption because its inclusion struck them all as obvious. What does it mean to seek a foundation for aesthetics in human experience and empirical observation? The supposition of the Scottish philosophers was that the taste by which we appreciate and enjoy beautiful things is one of our intellectual powers. To understand it correctly, we must determine just how the mind works with regard to this particular power. Accordingly, we have to draw the relevant data both from the introspection of our own experience and the observation of human beings at large, including the structure of natural languages and the sentiments expressed in literature. In short, the task of aesthetics is to arrive at general principles based upon facts about the characteristic operations of the human mind. Moral philosophy so conceived was modeled on natural philosophy, as revolutionized by Newton. But it had the additional value of being applicable to deliberation and action. It promised genuine enlightenment, not simply by uncovering true empirical generalizations, but by using these in the education and improvement of our faculties. Empirical observations were to replace both dogmatic pronouncements from self or socially appointed authorities and from the empty abstractions of rationalistic philosophers. I hope I've already indicated how similar in many ways these concerns from the 18th century were to the concerns that animate new approaches now. The Scottish philosophers who wrote on these matters did not use the term aesthetics. Like Hume, they spoke instead of criticism or taste and beauty. Properly conducted scientific investigation of the faculty of taste, they thought, would tell us why human beings care about beauty, at the same time enable us to identify the things that are properly regarded as beautiful. In this way, they hoped to improve the faculty of taste by better understanding the psychological faculty that is specially attuned to beauty. In short, they regarded aesthetics as a normative science. Elsewhere, however, serious doubt was expressed about the possibility of such a science. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant, another hugely influential figure in the development of aesthetics, gave powerful expression to this doubt. From the Kantian point of view, if we are to identify the distinctive way in which the mind responds to beauty, we must first determine what the beautiful is. It's only once we have identified beautiful objects that we can ask questions about the psychology of our response to them. To think otherwise is to attempt a correlation between two things, the faculty of taste and the phenomenon of beauty, in the absence of one of them. Empirical observation can ground generalizations about the sorts of things that people take delight in as a matter of fact. But such generalizations tell us nothing about whether they are right to do so or not. Psychological preferences are not the same as rational judgments. Logic cannot be grounded in psychology, since people often reason fallaciously. It follows that how people reason and how they ought to reason are quite different questions. And the same point, Kant contended, can be made about taste. Human beings can delight in disfiguration as well as ornamentation. Or, as we might say, people can be pleased by kitsch as well as art. On the strength of this objection, Kant went on to elaborate an alternative and very influential account of the mind's operation with respect to beauty. But for present purposes, though, it's enough to note that if Kant is right, a science of beauty, such as these Scottish philosophers aim to develop, is mistaken on two counts. It seeks a psychological foundation that cannot serve its purposes, and it has educational ambitions that cannot be realized. And it's obviously interesting to ask today whether Kant was right or not. My purpose in this paper, however, is to explore the challenge that Kant presents to the science of beauty as it was understood in the Scottish Enlightenment. And a good place to start is David Hume's famous essay, Of the Standard of Taste, first published in 1757. In this essay, Hume attempts, with considerable ingenuity, to reconcile two seemingly opposing phenomena. Everyone agrees, he thinks, that taste is necessarily a subjective matter. This seems to imply, as an ancient Latin tag has it, that about matters of taste there can be no disputing. Yet, Hume thinks, no one actually subscribes to this contention. On the contrary, people vigorously engage in debate and argument about the artistic quality of poems, paintings, books, and so on, and they seek to persuade and dissuade each other that some are better than others. Now, if taste is indeed a matter of subjectively experienced pleasure, how could there be a standard of taste by which some people's pleasurable experiences are shown to be better than others? Either we simply record what people in general find aesthetically pleasing, or, like Kant, we find some other way of determining what they ought to find pleasing. Hume's resolution of the problem as he sets himself is this: though the principles of taste be universal and nearly, if not entirely, the same in all men, yet few are qualified to give judgment on any work of art or establish their own sentiment as the standard of beauty. The organs of internal sensation are seldom so perfect as to allow the general principles their full play. They either labor under some defect or are vitiated by some disorder, and by that means excite a sentiment which may be pronounced erroneous. Judgments of beauty, in other words, are indeed subjective sentiments, but if such sentiments are to be just, we need not only a faculty of taste, but the education of that faculty. An educated faculty of taste will satisfy a number of conditions, namely, Hume says, strong common sense, united to delicate sentiment, improved by practice, perfected by comparison, cleared of all prejudice. The satisfaction of these conditions can alone entitle critics to this valuable character, and the joint verdict of such, wherever they are to be found, is the true standard of taste and beauty. In short, only the correctly situated and properly prepared person can be said to respond to beauty in accordance with truly universal principles of taste. The vast majority of people in this view, when they declare that they are pleased by the beauty of something, are either ignorant of these principles or applying them defectively. They're truly expressing their sentiments, certainly, but their sentiments are erroneous in the sense that they arise from imperfect apprehension. On Hume's account of the matter, we can rightly find art objects beautiful even if they were created in a period or a culture marked by scientific beliefs, religious practices, or social fashions that we now think false or foolish. The poet's monument more durable than brass, he says, must fall to the ground like common brick or clay, were men to make no allowance for the continual revolutions of manners and customs. And in his other most famous essay, he makes a similar claim, that human beings can take aesthetic pleasure in paintings and plays and so on that depict levels of suffering that the same people would in everyday contexts find horribly distressing. It seems then that the faculty of taste has a special ability to find beauty where we might not expect to. Now, opinions differ on whether Hume successfully resolves the problem he set himself, and here I only want to highlight a problem relevant to the present topic. There's an obvious tension between Hume's claim that the principles of taste are universal and his claim that only a small minority of people ever apply them accurately. Furthermore, while he thinks that the passage of time is the ultimate test and vindication of the universality of good taste, he also acknowledges that there is very rarely true unanimity in aesthetic judgment, and even educated and open-minded people often continue to diverge considerably in their aesthetic assessments and artistic preferences. His explanation of this is the result of variety in both personal characteristics and cultural influences. But if this is true, what substance is left to the belief that the tests of time will reveal universal principles of taste, and why should we regard those principles as psychological dispositions built into the human mind? As in other contexts, Hume's account of these matters may be contrasted with that of his greatest contemporary critic, Thomas Reid. Reid was no less committed to the project of the science of human nature than Hume, but he thought that Hume was pursuing it in the wrong way. Consequently, Reid often expounds a view that, while strikingly similar to Hume's, reverses the role of certain key concepts. Reid also wrote an essay on taste, and it appears as the last of his essays on the intellectual powers of man. In this essay, he asserts that, quote, "Our judgment of beauty is not indeed a dry and unaffecting judgment, like that of a mathematical or metaphysical truth." Clearly Reid disagreed. Though he's a fine mathematician himself, actually, but he disagreed with some of the things that have been said earlier. "By the constitution of our nature, it is accompanied with an agreeable feeling or emotion, for which we have no other name but the sense of beauty. This sense of beauty, like the perceptions of our other senses, implies not only a feeling, but an opinion of some quality in the object that occasions that feeling." Now, this evidently is very close to Hume's view of the matter, but with a crucial difference. Where Hume supposes that the feeling gives rise to our opinion, Reid thinks it's the opinion that gives rise to the feeling. For Hume, we judge something beautiful because we find it aesthetically pleasing, which means that any proposition about its beauty or its ugliness will be an expression of feeling. For Reid, on the contrary, we derive pleasure from the contemplation of those things we first judge to be beautiful, and are repelled by those we judge to be ugly. The judgment does not express the pleasure, it causes it. Reid's principal argument in favor of this alternative is an observation about linguistic usage. If it be said that the perception of beauty is merely a feeling in the mind that perceives, without any belief or excellence in the object, the necessary consequence is that when I say Virgil's Georgics is a beautiful poem, I mean not to say anything about the poem, but only something concerning myself and my feelings. But why should I use a language that expresses the contrary of what I mean? Even those who hold beauty to be merely a feeling in the person that perceives it find themselves under a necessity of expressing themselves as if beauty were solely a quality of the object and not the percipient. No reason can be given, he adds, why all mankind should express themselves thus, but that they believe what they say. It is therefore contrary to the universal sense of mankind expressed in their language that beauty is not really in the object, but is merely a feeling to the person who's said to perceive it. For Reid, then, judgment is primary, feeling is secondary. It's because we judge something beautiful that we experience agreeable feelings, because we judge it ugly that we experience revulsion. As a matter of experience, aesthetic judgments and pleasurable feelings often occur simultaneously. But Reid's point is that aesthetic judgment is logically, not necessarily chronologically, prior to feeling. By insisting on this point, Reid can make more sense of the puzzle with which Hume wrestles. How can there be debate and discussion if aesthetic taste is a special kind of feeling? Reid thinks, and this echoes something that's been said a few times, Reid thinks that with respect to simple judgments of beauty, a face, a flower, a melody, there is generally unanimity. That's because in these cases, we're relying on instinctive judgments that do not require complicated thought processes. That's why Reid thinks, as other people have said here this morning, that there are important cases where you ask children. Let's start with the children. Careful analysis and extended reflection are not required in these cases. That's why you uncover more easily general principles of agreement. By contrast, in the appraisal of complex works of art, simple instinct is not enough. In these cases, careful analysis and extended reflection are needed. And this leaves lots of scope for error and uncertainty. And that's why disagreement is likely. In these cases, though, aesthetic judgment is still prior, because uncertainty in our judgments will lead to uncertain feelings. If judgment is not the expression of pleasurable feeling, what exactly is it that we are judging when we declare something to be beautiful? Reid, like so many, is struck by the great variety of things to which the adjective beautiful can be applied. Beauty, he says, is found in things so various and so very different in nature that it's difficult to say wherein it consists, or what, I might just say, contrary to Clive Bell, there could be common to all the objects in which it is found. We find beauty in colour, in sound, in form, in motion. There are beauties of speech, beauties of thought, beauties in the arts, beauties in the sciences, in actions, in affections, in characters. In things so different and so unlike, is there any quality, the same in all, by which we may call them with the name of beauty? What can it be that is common to the thought of the mind, the form of a piece of matter, an abstract theorem, a stroke of wit? Why should things so different be called by the same name? This can't be the reason. Reid thinks there is a reason, but it can't be the apprehension of some common property, beautifulness, which mysteriously is able to inhere in objects as ontologically diverse as flowers, poems, faces, melodies, and mathematical proofs. Rather, judgments of beauty are manifestations of our natural admiration for excellence. The delight we take in beauty arises from our judging something to be excellent. And of course, this judgment must be made in terms of standards of the relevant kind. The thought of the mind, the form of a piece of matter, an abstract theorem can all be beautiful, not because they have some property in common, but because they all achieve distinctive kinds of excellence. Now, in this view, excellence is a natural norm. That's to say, excellence in things does please us, but also it ought to please us. We are pleased by the excellent because it is excellent, and we ought to be pleased because it is excellent. So, contra Hume, we can't derive a standard of taste by surveying our feelings, or even the feelings of an educated minority, but happily, we don't need to do so. Their excellence is not a projection of our feelings, which would carry the absurd implication that believing something to be excellent actually makes it excellent. No, their excellence is a function of the kind of thing that they are. By Reid's account, then, feeling matters because judgments of beauty, unlike judgments of truth, are not dry and unaffecting. Nevertheless, taste itself is not a sentiment, but the exercise of our rational faculty as we assess degrees of excellence. And Reid thus offers us a conception of the science of beauty that can overcome Kant's objection by being both descriptive and normative. Having declared morals and criticisms to be sciences in the treatise, Hume returned to the topic some years later in his first inquiry. But now their classification as sciences is heavily qualified. Morals and criticisms, he tells us there, are not so properly objects of the understanding as of taste and sentiment. Beauty, whether moral or natural, is felt more properly than perceived. Or, if we reason concerning it and endeavour to fix its standard, we regard a new fact, the general taste of mankind, or some such fact, which may be the object of reasoning and inquiry. This passage, where Hume is sort of changing his mind, contrasts sharply with Reid on the same topic. Our moral and rational powers justly claim dominion over the whole man. Even taste is not exempted from their authority. It must be subject to that authority in every case where we pretend to reason or dispute about matters of taste. It's the voice of reason that our love or admiration ought to be proportioned to the merit of the object. When it's not grounded in real worth, it must be the effect of constitution or some habit or some casual association. It seems obvious that anything we might call the science of criticism or the science of beauty must involve the exercise of reason. And both Reid and Hume thought this indeed to be the case. For Reid, in a poem, in a picture, in a piece of music, it is real excellence that pleases a good taste. Accordingly, the aim of a science of beauty must be to trace the structure of perfection. And Reid contends that it's the ability to do this that unites the critic and the artist. The most perfect works of art, he says, have a beauty that strikes even the rude and the ignorant. But they see only a small part of that beauty, which is seen in such works by those who understand them perfectly and can produce them. On this account, then, aesthetics truly is a normative science, since it is the exercise of critical reason that both deepens our appreciation of artworks and guides our artistic activity. The science of reasoning and inquiry that Hume's conception holds out to us, on the other hand, could only encompass facts about psychological responses. As he puts it, the general taste of mankind, or some such fact, and never an account of the phenomena to which those are the responses. It is a science, a psychological science, that could be, and perhaps it is, pursued with much greater rigor and sophistication by modern empirical psychology than was ever the case with the relatively primitive introspective psychology of Hume's day. Yet it remains the case that even this much more sophisticated type of psychology, if it is divorced, and necessarily so, from anything properly called normative criticism, encounters a problem. Any attempt to found aesthetic norms on this sort of experience and observation can only result in absurdity. Consider America's Most Wanted. This picture was assembled by Vitaly Komar and Alexander Melamed in 1994 on the basis of extensive empirical research into aesthetic preferences. And it strove to combine into a single work the most generally held preferences. But ironically, the result, as Arthur Danto observes, is a painting that no one would want. A realistic rendering of a lakeside scene that includes, among other popular preferences, George Washington and a hippopotamus. Actually, on this representation, you can't quite see the hippopotamus. It's right over here, sitting by the bank. I'm afraid that's the best reproduction I could get. But, now, the late Arthur Danto, one of the most influential philosophers of aesthetics, himself a very great art critic and very profoundly sympathetic to modern art, he thinks that if we view this, America's Most Wanted, not as a painting, but as a performance piece, consisting in a combination of the opinion poll, the picture, and the attendant publicity, then what Komar and Melamed produced can indeed be considered a masterpiece and properly described as postmodern, humorous, and iconic. If America's Most Wanted does indeed qualify for these commendatory epithets, it's not because it faithfully incorporates all the aesthetic preferences that careful empirical investigation has shown to be widespread. It's because the painting has achieved excellence of a quite different kind. As a painting, it's just bad. As a visual reductio ad absurdum, it is brilliant. Moreover, the absurdity it reveals should make us skeptical about at least some attempts to enrich aesthetics by empirical observation. So, in this way, America's Most Wanted serves to confirm that if there can be an empirical science of beauty, it must be conceived normatively in the way that Reid conceives it, or perhaps I'll state that a little more lightly. It might be better to conceive it normatively in the way Reid conceives it than psychologically, at least in the way that Hume conceives it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. point out that as a past president of this august body, I am full of admiration, of course, for the Scottish Enlightenment, and totally agree with everything you said. But as a past president of the other body down in London, I have to point out that whereas the 18th century was a great period in Edinburgh, the 17th century was an equally great period in England, where we had the Royal Society being founded, where Locke played an important role, Newton played an important role, and of course, we mustn't be too insular. It was across to the continent. And of course, the ideas in England at the time were preceded by ideas of great philosophers in Europe, Pascal, Descartes, and of course Erasmus. So you have to trace the history of this much further back. I'm all in favour of the emphasis on Scotland here, but we mustn't forget that Scotland had great periods before that in England and on the continent. We have here some distinguished visitors from the Netherlands, for example, who I'm sure would confirm that. So, all with you, but let's keep some kind of sense of balance.
Well, let me just say I think I can speak with complete impartiality since I'm Irish. But I did not mean to descant or indeed play up in any way Scotland. The connection is partly with the Royal Society. But I do think this is true, that although you get philosophers who speak of beauty as far back as Plato, the subject of aesthetics and how it might be pursued systematically is an 18th century invention. It's certainly not exclusively Scottish, but and the greatest, most influential figure is really Immanuel Kant. The point I wanted, or only historical point I'd like to make, is this: the term aesthetics was invented by Alexander Baumgarten. Kant picks it up and criticizes Baumgarten's conception. But 10 years before that, with the publication of Hutchison's book, though the Scots never used the term, they had begun to do what in fact Baumgarten wanted to see done and Kant thought was a mistake. So that's the context. Hume, of course, is relying quite heavily in his psychology on John Locke before him. And I would say the objections that Reid brings against Hume, he brings equally against Locke. So I just meant to point to this particular period. I will say, again being Irish, I do think it is remarkable that a poor country on the fringes of Europe produced such an extraordinary intellectual flowering.
Yes. Professor Zeki.
May I just comment on Reid and Hume and to a lesser extent on Kant? I think they failed to distinguish between biological beauty. You see, there is a confusion that they speak of all kinds of beauty. They do not distinguish between biological beauty, which I believe is inherited, and in which I include the beauty of faces and bodies and landscapes. I think Kant, up to a point, did. And artifactual beauty, which of course Kant made a big issue of. The other problem for me with Kant is that Kant believed that some kinds of beauty are not interfaced through a concept, whereas others are. I think all experiences of beauty are interfaced through a concept. The biological ones are through inherited concept, because I think it's very unlikely that you find anyone in any part of the world who find someone with one eye up here and another eye down here beautiful. It's very unlikely. And because we have got a concept of what a human face and a human body should be like. And you're much more knowledgeable than I am in these matters. I sort of think one of the confusions that these people, without exception, fell into is the failure to distinguish between the concepts of biological beauty and other kinds of beauty.
Let me say, I think there are a very deep difference between Kant and, on the other side together, Hume and Reid and all the other figures that I put up. Kant's big problem is that he thinks that if you're going to make something rational, you have to exclude all the empirical stuff. And that, it seems to me, is why in his third critique, when he turns the attention to a third form of judgment, broadly speaking, aesthetic judgment, then he has to take a quite different line. And that is a serious problem. But I do think that Hume and Reid meant to. They may not have, by modern standards, done so very successfully, but they meant to incorporate, by observation introspection, the empirical basis of aesthetic judgment. But my theme is you can incorporate it this way or that way. And Hume's way of incorporating it such is my story, Hume's way of incorporating it does fall foul of Kant's objection. Reid's does not. That's my basic theme, yes. Well, let me just, I think there is a distinction between the emphasis on excellence and perfection. You can strive for perfection and thereby produce that which is excellent without reaching perfection. And judgments of excellence, at least within this framework, are essentially judgments of fittedness. So the idea is that, and then you need a context. So you take, say, a joke or a piece of comedy. When people say that's excellent, it does not mean it's perfect in this sense that nobody could ever do it better. It means that on this occasion, in this context, that was terrific. So judgments of excellence can be genuinely judgments of excellence, but fall pretty far short of perfection. And we all think this in a strange sort of way when we grade essays and so on. We think this essay was absolutely excellent, but the day might come when I got a better one. So we hesitate to declare them perfect. So there is that, I think, that difference. One further comment I may make. The judgment of excellence and its fittedness to context, the judgment of perfection, at least in a rationalist way, is perfection of form. I think that's a different way of thinking.
So what I took out of your talk, and maybe you can tell me if I misunderstood, is that one can reconcile Hume and Reid by seeing that actually they're talking about two different concepts which happen to go by the same name. So one is a more instinctive beauty, which has a sensory basis and which is subconscious. One is a more intellectual beauty, for which you have to reason and have a backstory really to the art. And so one of the problems with your art historian and why people didn't want to use them as a subject is, of course, they experience both. Whereas your untutored child will only experience the instinctive beauty, and your mathematician is limited to the intellectual beauty. because there isn't a sensory. I mean, Euler's formula in itself is not a beautiful object. One has to understand what it's about.
I don't think in the end Hume and Reid can be reconciled, so I wasn't trying to do that. The difference is that Hume is trying to construct an account of beauty that in some sense is immediate and instinctive, but at the same time he recognizes, who could deny, that people argue and debate and talk about it. Now, the solution that you gestured towards is one that separates these things and says there's these ones over here, and this where the babies talk, and this one over here where the grown-up people talk. And that's not ever going to really get these two things together. So Reid's picture is that there are simple judgments about which babies and everybody agreed, and there are complex judgments about whole works of art. And of course you're going to get disagreement there. We strive for agreement, but we will get disagreement. So just to take an example that somebody produced earlier in the day, the Impressionists, I mean, there you might say what goes is not that standards of beauty changed. It's rather that people got much better at judging and seeing and understanding what was going on. So that's the trajectory. It's not a really attempt to reconcile Hume and Reid.
I wonder whether defining beauty is fraught with difficulty in the sense that it's an open-ended quality which you can't define, but you know it when you see it. And I'm thinking in terms of comparable problems when you come to discussing virtue. Linda Zabzebski, as you probably know, has recently come up with a theory which says that rather than define a virtue, you should define it in terms of the examples of virtue, rather than define it in concrete terms. And I wonder whether the same thing is true of beauty. You define it in terms of the objects of beauty that people recognize and agree on.
Well, somebody said long ago, a philosopher of science actually said a long time ago, definitions are like belts. either they're elastic enough to accommodate everybody, or else they're too narrow and exclude too many. And I think that I certainly want to think you're not hiding to nothing to try to define things. At the same time, except for strictly technical purposes, of course, but at the same time, when people say beauty is an open-ended thing, or virtue is an open-ended thing, but we know it when we see it, part of the problem is, no, we don't know it when we see it. People get these things wrong. So let us just to take, and on a major scale perhaps, so let's just, not say beautiful, but I'll just take a contemporary example. It seems to me that the vast sales attracted by 50 Shades of Grey is not go any distance at all to making it a fine novel. So popularity can be massive. Now, when you turn to, say, J.K. Rowling, I think here there's an open question, and Hume, of course, and others would have said, the test of time will tell as to whether there is within it that which actually sustains the kind of judgments that we get, sustains those judgments. So there's a sort of open-endedness here that says, yeah, let's not take it as fixed, because these things do emerge. But that's different, I think, from saying that, and indeed contrary to saying, we know it when we see it.
If some people get it wrong, who decides what's right?
Well, this is the great thing about aesthetics. Nobody needs to decide. Of course, when decisions are made, it's often about purchasing a portrait or purchasing or publishing a novel or whatever. Or, for that matter, in the education curriculum, what ought to be studied or ought not to be studied, what's worth studying, not. And it's not, these practical decisions have to be made, but in the end, nobody decides finally. And that's why I think these guys certainly would have laid great store by the test of time. Victorian dramas that now we would just laugh at if we didn't, melodramas, that we laugh at and certainly wouldn't want to watch or see, were hugely popular. Well, that's, Oscar Wilde says at one point, which it says something about Dickens. Let me say, I admire Dickens, but Oscar Wilde once remarked that the man has no heart who can read the death of little Nell without laughing. And there's that dimension to Dickens. Yes.
Thank you. Yes. Further questions, comments? Yes, please.
So I was intrigued by this remark. You said, but why should things so different be called by the same name? Mm-hmm. Now, as a scientist, I'm sort of interested in objective measures in this sort of world of exploring what people consider beautiful or not. And I think this reification of what we actually name beautiful might be a problem because it's culturally varied and is in fact identified with many things. So the question is it perhaps possible that there would be measurements of beauty or aesthetic response based not on words, but on other sort of signatures of human reaction?
Well, let me just, see what I think is, and this is, if I say so, often characteristic of scientists, there are people who think that if you can't quantify, you can't assess. It's a constant tendency of the human spirit almost to think, I'll be happy if only I can put numbers on it. And of course we mislead ourselves by using systems of numbering that are actually representations of quality rather than quantity. So, and academics in universities have struggled with this. In America, they use grading. We used to, in the good old days, use percentages, but then people thought these were real numbers as opposed to assessments, and so they computed them, and people thought, we better move back to excellent and satisfactory because these we're not misled into thinking you can compute them. So there can be assessments, and certainly assessments of beauty. I myself hold out, and rational assessments, but I don't hold out any hope for quantification, for measurement in that sense.
I guess maybe I was too strict in my words there. I meant simply measurables, which are not words and not response to words.
Mm. Well, you need to tell me then. I mean, if I say, for example, that some piece of music is trite, whereas another piece is sophisticated. Is that a measurable assessment?
Again, the heart of the question was beyond words, so not reification.
Oh, but I'm talking
words.
about I'm talking about the music. I'm not talking about the words. I'm talking about the music.
Does my neighbour mean like tasting wine, for instance, where some people want to put points on it, but others just want to drink it?
And since we're heading up for lunchtime, I think can't promise you wine, but upstairs where we had coffee, from 12:30 they'll be serving some lunch. Can I ask you to thank this morning's speaker very warmly?
Thank you very much.